She was one of the best ICU nurses in London until one memo changed everything. The hospital demanded she remove her hijab. She refused. No protest, no headline, just one quiet word. No. They called it a health risk. She called it obedience. They gave her 72 hours to comply. She kept showing up veiled, calm, unwavering. But then something happened. A dying patient who couldn't speak asked for her, not by name, by scent. "You smell like safety," he whispered. What makes a woman risk her career for a cloth? What happens when faith walks into policy and won't bow? Press 1 if this story pulls you in. Press 2 if it doesn't. But stay till the end, because she didn't just save lives. She saved something deeper. The email came at 6:47 a.m., right before the start of her shift. Amina Rahman scrolled through the subject line twice to be sure it was real, urgent, new infection control, uniform protocol. Immediate compliance required. The attached PDF was cold and clinical like most hospital memos. But buried within the sterile bullet points in legalese was one line that made her heart tighten. All head coverings, religious or otherwise, must be removed in sterile units unless issued by Trust Infection Control Services. Amina's thumb paused mid-scroll. She read it again and again. Behind her, the ICU lights flickered to life. Monitors beeped softly. The scent of sanitizer hung in the air. Another day, another shift. But this one was different. Because today, her hijab, the cloth she wore not as a symbol, but as a surrender, was now considered a breach of safety. She folded the phone gently and tucked it into her locker, then pulled her scrub cap over her head not to conceal her faith, but to protect it. Amina had worked at St. Edmund's Hospital for 6 years. She'd held the hands of dying strangers, sat beside sobbing sons and sleepless mothers. Her voice had calmed heart monitors. Her touch had steadied the shaking. She didn't talk much. She didn't draw attention. But everyone knew if Amina was on shift, patients were in good hands. She never once removed her hijab, not in surgery prep, not in trauma response, not during a pandemic. And no one had ever questioned it until now. By mid-morning, whispers had started in the nurses' lounge. Did you see the policy they're making her choose? She's not above the rules. Amina stood at the coffee machine, her eyes cast downward. She didn't respond, didn't explain. Because some convictions aren't meant to be defended in conversation, they're meant to be lived in silence. Later that day, Dr. Miles, a young registrar, pulled her aside. "Amina," he said gently, "you know I respect you, but the administration is serious. They'll suspend staff who don't comply." She looked at him. "I respect you too, doctor, but I didn't start wearing this because it was allowed, and I won't stop because it's not." He hesitated. "Isn't there any flexibility?" Amina's voice didn't rise. "There is, with everything but obedience." When she clocked out that evening, the corridor lights flickered overhead. A janitor passed with his mop, nodding respectfully. She returned the gesture, then walked slowly down the empty hall, her steps steady, her veil undisturbed, her heart quiet, but unshaken. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but she could feel it gathering, in the quiet corners of policy, in the silence of colleagues, in the eyes that watched but said nothing. Still, she walked on. Because some things you don't wear for approval. You wear them for Allah. The meeting was brief. Too brief, Amina thought, for something that carried this much weight. She sat in a small office on the 5th floor, beneath a framed print of the NHS Code of Ethics. Across from her sat Mrs. Whitmore, head of compliance, flanked by 2 senior administrators. One of them scribbled notes. The other didn't meet her eyes. Amina, Mrs. Whitmore, began with the politeness of someone trying to sweeten a bitter pill. "We value your service. No one questions your professionalism. You've been with us for years. You're well loved. But that word always signals the turn. Effective immediately, the Trust's new sterilization standards require all staff in sterile zones to comply with a standardized uniform. No external garments, including scarves or head coverings, are allowed unless issued by our infection control department." Amina nodded once. "I read the memo." "We're giving everyone 72 hours to adapt," Whitmore continued. "This isn't a personal decision. It's about safety." Amina's eyes stayed steady. "I understand, but I won't remove my hijab." The room stilled. Mrs. Whitmore blinked. "We're not trying to be unreasonable, nor am I," Amina said softly. We've offered sterile-approved alternatives, said the man beside her. Caps neck guards fully compliant. They're designed to... With respect, Amina interrupted, I've already worn a sterile scrub cap over my hijab for 6 years. Without complaint, without issue. I'm not refusing cleanliness, I'm refusing compromise. Whitmore leaned forward. This is a matter of public trust. And mine, Amina replied, is in God. She left the office without a raised voice. No protest, no argument. Only calm. But by the next morning the ward had shifted. People weren't unkind, just quieter, more careful around her, as if faith were something contagious. Some avoided eye contact. Others offered strained smiles. And then there were the ones who whispered, I mean, can't she just take it off during shift? Why make it a thing? It's not about religion, it's hygiene. She heard it all and responded to none of it. Because not all wars are fought in headlines. Some are waged inside locker rooms, in silent stares, in half-finished sentences and awkward silences in the staff kitchen. By noon, she was called again, this time by the nurse supervisor, Helen Chambers, a woman Amina had worked beside for years. They had shared grief over a young cancer patient, cried after losing a colleague to COVID. Now Helen wouldn't look her in the eye. Amina, she said carefully, you've always been steady, one of the best. You know that. Amina nodded. Thank you. But rules are rules. And if you don't adapt, I'll be forced to send you home. Amina paused. Would I be suspended? Helen looked pained. Not yet. It would be a neutral leave. Pending review. I understand, Amina said. Helen finally looked up. Why, Amina? Just for now. You're not trying to prove something, are you? Amina shook her head gently. I'm not proving anything. I'm preserving something. Helen exhaled, rubbing her forehead. You're really prepared to lose your job over this. I didn't start this job for approval, she said, and I won't trade my obedience for a paycheck. At the end of the shift, Amina returned to the changing room. Her locker was cleaner than usual. Too clean, as if the janitors had already begun erasing her presence. She sat down, untied her laces, and reached for her bag. On the bench beside her was a folded piece of paper. No signature, no name. Just a single sentence in small, careful handwriting. You make me want to be brave. She stared at it for a long time, then folded it once and placed it gently into her pocket right next to her work badge. The next morning she showed up again. Same scrubs, same veil, same silence. Security didn't stop her, but they didn't greet her either. She walked to the ward as usual, past beds and machines, past curious eyes and unfinished whispers. The patient smiled. She smiled back. And when a young boy in room 302 cried from the pain of an injection, she was the one who calmed him. Not with a face, not with policy, but with hands that had held so much and thus still knew how to hold gently. Whispers are a kind of weather. They shift the air before anyone notices. And by the third day, the ward felt colder. Amina moved through it the way she always had, calm, focused, precise. Blood pressure, medication rounds, post-op charts. She didn't miss a step, but the tone around her had changed. She's still wearing it. Didn't they give her the warning? She'll be out by next week. I heard she's making it a religious case. Amina heard the voices behind curtains in hallways across scrub stations. But she said nothing. Not because she didn't have words, because her dignity didn't require noise. On the surface, her colleagues remained professional. They handed off charts. They nodded politely. But there were fewer shared coffees, fewer hallway smiles. Even Nurse Patel, who once brought samosas every Friday, looked at her with unease as if Amina's veil had become a mask for something dangerous. By lunchtime, she sat alone in the break room. No one said it aloud. But absence speaks loudly when chairs that were once full are suddenly empty. She stirred her tea slowly, remembering the warmth this room used to hold. Now it felt like standing in a room where the fire had gone out and everyone was pretending it wasn't cold. But not everyone kept their distance. Later that afternoon, as Amina adjusted the IV line of an elderly patient, a voice came from behind her, soft, hesitant. "You're Amina, right?" She turned. It was Malik, a new intern from respiratory, fresh out of medical school, wide-eyed, eager, nervous. "I just wanted to say," he continued, shifting on his feet. "What you're doing, it's brave." She looked at him calmly. "I'm not trying to be brave. Just obedient. He nodded awkwardly. Still, not many people would hold their ground like that. Amina offered him a small smile. It's not hard when you've already made peace with the cost. In room 214, a patient named John, an older woman recovering from heart surgery, asked for extra blankets. As Amina laid them over her gently, John reached out and touched her wrist. "You smell like jasmine," she said with a tired smile. Amina chuckled. "That's just the hand lotion." No, Jean whispered, "It smells like comfort." There was a silence, a pause in the machine's rhythm. "My daughter stopped visiting," Jean added, voice breaking. "She says she's too busy." "I know it's a lie." Amina didn't respond with advice. She simply pulled the blanket higher, smoothed it around Jean's shoulders and whispered, "I'm still here." Jean's eyes shimmered. "Thank you." But beyond the individual moments of grace, pressure continued to build. That evening, while walking to the staff parking lot, Amina overheard two junior doctors near the exit. "She's being dramatic," one said. "It's a hospital, not a mosque. She's going to cost herself her career." She kept walking, didn't slow, didn't confront, because what she wore wasn't about them, and neither was her silence. When she arrived home that night, her mother was waiting, seated on the living room rug, prayer beads in hand, tea steaming gently beside her. "You're late," her mother said. Amina placed her bag down and sat. "They're going to suspend me soon," she said, quietly, calmly. Her mother didn't flinch. "Did I ever tell you," she said softly, "why I started wearing the hijab?" Amina shook her head. "Your grandmother wore it during the protests back home. Police ripped it from her head in front of a crowd. She tied it back on and said, 'They can't arrest my modesty.'" Amina looked down, eyes welling. She said her mother continued, "We cover our heads not because we're ashamed, but because we remember who our heads bow to." Amina closed her eyes. Sometimes it takes a story from another time to remind you you're standing on the shoulders of quiet giants. The next morning she woke before dawn, prayed Fajr while the sky was still velvet blue, tied her hijab slowly, carefully. She looked in the mirror, not for vanity but for resolve. And then she whispered, "Ya Allah, if I lose this job, let it not cost me my sincerity." She walked out the door with her badge on one side of her chest and a folded piece of paper on the other. "You make me want to be brave." The call came just after 3 a.m. The ward was dim lit only by the soft glow of monitors and the low hum of machines breathing for tired lungs. Most nurses moved like shadows, half asleep, half alert. But Amina was always steady, even now, even with the weight of potential suspension pressing against her back. Nurse Chambers approached, her expression unreadable. "Amina," she said, voice low. "You're being requested." Amina blinked. "By who? Room 409. End-of-life patient. Transferred from St. Michael's 2 hours ago. Male. Late-stage renal failure. Non-verbal until recently. Just started speaking. Asked for the woman with jasmine hands." Amina's breath caught. Room 409. She knew the name before she even entered. The hallway was cold. Still, she walked quietly toward the room, her mind turning through faded memories. 4 months ago, during her rotation at St. Michael's, a patient in room 22 had refused to eat. He'd been unresponsive, angry, alone. She had spoken softly to him, wiped his brow with a warm cloth, rubbed a bit of jasmine-scented lotion into his cracked hands, a small kindness. An unspoken prayer. He never looked at her, never said her name, but he had held her hand once just before slipping into another coma. That patient was Mr. Harold Whitaker, and now he was awake and asking for her. When she entered the room, the lights were low. He looked thinner, older, eyes sunken, skin pale. But he turned when he heard her footsteps, slowly, deliberately, and he smiled. She approached the bed, soft and measured. "You remembered me," she said gently. His voice was hoarse, a whisper from a well too deep. "You're the one who stayed quiet," he rasped. "The one who didn't try to fix me with words." She sat beside him. "I'm still not very good at speeches." He chuckled, coughed. "I heard what they're doing, making you choose." Amina looked down. "I've already chosen." He studied her veil. His eyes were kind now, less afraid. "I never understood it," he said, "this cloth. But I never felt safer. than when you were near." Tears stung her eyes. He reached out with a trembling hand and she took it lightly, respectfully. "I've had nurses come and go," he said. "But you walked like you weren't just healing bodies. You were carrying something else." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Outside the room, word began to spread. By morning, the story moved like breath through the halls. A dying man had asked specifically for the veiled nurse. Not for the head nurse, not for the senior doctor, for Amina. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others paused and reconsidered. Even Chambers seemed different when she approached her later that morning. Was he lucid? Amina nodded. Perfectly. "And he remembered your name?" "No," Amina said softly, "but he remembered my hands." Chambers said nothing for a moment, then quietly added, "He hasn't spoken to anyone in weeks." In the staff lounge, tension had turned to curiosity. She was requested by a terminal case. Maybe this whole thing isn't about the veil after all. And still Amina said nothing. Because when sincerity speaks, you don't need to explain it. At 9:12 a.m., just before the end of her shift, Mr. Whitaker passed away. A peaceful departure, no struggle, no pain. Amina was there, at his side. She recited quietly, not aloud, but within her chest a prayer for ease, a plea for mercy. She straightened his blanket, closed his eyes, smoothed his pillow. Then she whispered the same words she had whispered to Jean in room 214. "I'm still here." That afternoon, while exiting the ward, she found an envelope taped to her locker. Inside was a single line written in careful cursive, "You helped my father die with peace, not because you showed your face, but because you showed him God through your hands." It was signed Eleanor Whitaker. Amina folded the letter slowly, pressed it against her heart, and for a moment she let herself feel the weight of what she had carried all along. Not just her veil, but the trust placed in it. The conference suite on the ground floor had been turned into a tribunal chamber. Fluorescent lights, rows of folding chairs, a single microphone at the center like an interrogation lamp. Amina stepped into a hush that felt colder than any winter draft. On one side sat the trust review panel, Mrs. Whitmore, 2 infection control officers, an HR solicitor, and the hospital's chief of surgery. Opposite them, a smattering of staff allowed to observe nurses, porters, interns' faces tight with curiosity, concern, or quiet judgment. At the back, Malik hovered, clutching a notepad he knew he wouldn't use. Next to him, Nurse Patel twisted her wedding band, eyes lowered in shame for yesterday's silence. Amina's chair faced the panel. No table, no barrier, only open space, as if transparency were measured in meters, not motives. Mrs. Whitmore began, voice precise. "Ms. Rahman, you are here to explain your continued non-compliance with Protocol IC-42. Do you understand the potential consequence, summary suspension without pay?" "I do," Amina answered, calm as dawn. "Then let us be clear," the HR solicitor cut in. "Will you remove your hijab while working in sterile zones if no alternative is granted today?" Amina's reply was soft, but it carried, "I cannot trade obedience for convenience." Pens scratched. A chair creaked. Someone exhaled too loudly. They presented evidence, first slides of microbial studies, photos of standardized hoods, legal precedents from other trusts. Every statistic felt like a stone being stacked against her. Still, Amina sat straight, fingers, laced, gaze steady but humble. When invited to speak, she rose without notes. "I have worked 6 years in ICU," she began, "through epidemic shortages, double shifts. My record shows 0 breaches of infection control. I have always worn a sterile cap over my hijab. No patient has been harmed by this cloth. Many, however, have been helped by the hands it covers." She paused, letting the silence ask its own questions. "I am told visibility equals safety. Yet a blind patient once told me he felt safest when I spoke verses over his morphine drip. He never saw my face. He trusted my sincerity." A murmur rippled through the observers. The solicitor leaned forward. "Sincerity is admirable, Ms. Rahman, but policy protects the many, not the few." Amina nodded. "Then why does this policy ignore Section 14C of the NHS Religious Accommodation Charter?" The solicitor hesitated. Whitmore's brow tightened. Before they could respond, a knock sounded. The door opened and Dr. Miles entered, breathless, clutching a sealed envelope. "Apologies, Chair, new evidence." He handed it to Whitmore and stepped back. Inside was Eleanor Whitaker's letter, the ink still fresh, plus a notarized statement. My father, Harold Whitaker, asked specifically for Nurse Amina Rahman in his final hours. Her presence, hijab included, offered comfort no drug could match. To call her cloth a hazard is to misunderstand healing itself. The chief of surgery read it twice, jaw tightening with some emotion he couldn't label. Whitmore cleared her throat. Personal anecdotes while moving do not override infection control. A voice rose from the observer's unexpected firm. It was Nurse Patel. Then add mine, she said, stepping forward. When my mother was admitted last year, it was Amina who stayed past midnight. Sterile cap, hijab and all. My mother left infection-free and hopeful. How many stats account for hope? Before security could usher her back, Malik spoke too. I've reviewed the pathogen audits. Amina's Bay reports fewer post-op infections than the ward average 3 years running. Numbers the panel's own language now stood at her side. The solicitor adjusted his glasses. Ms. Rahman, would you accept a trust-issued, fully sealed hood that covers the hijab entirely? Amina shook her head gently. My hijab is not a hat to be hidden. It is a covenant. If you bury it, you bury the meaning. Whitmore sighed, the battle between paperwork and something deeper flickering across her face. After private whispers, the panel asked everyone to step outside. 20 minutes later, they called Amina alone. Judge and witness in the same breath, Whitmore delivered the decision. No suspension. Continued duty with current sterile cap over hijab pending an external audit. A multi-faith task force to draft permanent accommodation guidelines Amina invited to co-author. The verdict felt lighter than victory, heavier than compromise. But it left her obedience intact. Amina placed a hand over her heart. Alhamdulillah. Whitmore managed a small, almost weary smile. Thank you for reminding us policy serves people, not the other way around. Outside, the observers waited. When Amina appeared, Malik's grin spoke louder than cheers. Nurse Patel wiped a tear, and even silent skeptics stepped aside, making room for her path. Yet Amina simply walked through the corridor, steady, modest, jasmine hands folded, whispering a prayer that tomorrow's resolve would be as pure as today's relief. Because battles end, but sincerity must wake up again. Every single shift. The days that followed the hearing were strangely quiet. No celebrations, no headlines, no congratulations from senior staff. Just a new kind of silence, not heavy like judgment, but weightless like a room finally exhaled. Amina returned to work as if nothing had changed, same veil beneath her sterile cap, same slow, careful hands, same smile tucked behind cloth. But in truth, everything had changed. Not in policy and perception. Eyes that once scanned her with suspicion now lingered longer, not to judge, but to try to understand. In the hospital canteen, someone left a cup of jasmine tea at her usual spot. No note, no name, just warmth waiting. She sat, she drank, and said nothing. Because some gratitude doesn't need to be voiced, it just needs to arrive. In the cardiac unit, a Syrian mother asked for Amina by name. I want the one who prays, she whispered in broken English. She smells like my home. In pediatrics, a child in chemo pressed a cloth over her doll's head. Look, she said proudly, mine wears a hijab too, like Nurse Amina. In small ways, invisible ways, Amina's choice had planted something that bloomed not in defiance, but in dignity. One afternoon, Chambers approached her during a chart update. Amina, she said quietly, I owe you more than I gave you. Amina looked up. I was scared, Chambers continued. Not of you, but of what it meant to defend something I didn't fully understand. You didn't just hold your ground. You reminded us what ground we were standing on. Amina offered a soft smile. There's no shame in confusion, only in refusing to listen. Chambers nodded, eyes glistening. I listened. I'm still listening. Later that week, the multi-faith accommodation meeting began. 6 people, 1 draft proposal, and Amina sat at the end of the table veil, intact pen in hand. The facilitator, a Sikh chaplain named Mr. Singh, opened with a verse from the Qur'an. There is no compulsion in religion. To the 256, and then he added, but in sincerity, there is strength beyond laws. The group reviewed policies from across Europe. Most were restrictive, few were fair, but the room didn't echo with arguments. It pulsed with testimonies. A Jewish midwife spoke of being told her head wrap was too political. A Christian surgeon recalled hiding his cross beneath his scrub top. A Hindu orderly shared that he'd once been laughed at for refusing beef in the staff canteen. And Amina listened, truly listened, because even in victory, humility still has a seat. During the final meeting, Dr. Miles joined briefly to deliver infection control results. The audits are back, he said. ICU reports show no increase in infection risk from religious garments when worn under sterile coverings. He looked up and smiled. Science isn't threatened by belief, only by ego. The room nodded. The policy was updated. Amina signed the bottom of the draft, ink smudging slightly on the final line. Sincere faith is not a contamination, it's a contribution. On her way out that evening, she passed a janitor sweeping the marble corridor. He paused, leaned on his broom, and said in his thick East African accent, "Sister, I saw what they tried. You didn't raise your voice, but you raised all of ours." She placed her hand over her heart. "Barak Allahu Fik," she whispered. He chuckled. "I don't speak Arabic, but I felt that." Later that night at home, her mother handed her a worn cloth bundle. Amina opened it carefully. Inside was an old hijab, faded soft, stitched by hand. "Your grandmother wore this in the protests," her mother said. "She was arrested in it, beaten in it. But she said it was the most peaceful she ever felt because she knew who she wore it for." Amina pressed the fabric to her face, and for the first time in weeks she cried. Not from exhaustion, not from pain, but from the mercy of being part of a line of women who didn't fight with fists but with faith. She prayed long that night. No requests, just gratitude. And when she finished, she whispered into her palms, "Ya Allah, let the ones who come after me never have to choose between your pleasure and their profession. And if they do, give them the courage to choose you." Spring arrived quietly in London. The cherry blossoms near the hospital gates had begun to bloom, and for the first time in weeks, the city felt less like a battlefield and more like a prayer answered in petals. Amina arrived for her shift early that morning. Same routine, same scrubs, same niqab tucked beneath her sterile cap. But today the badge clipped to her uniform had something new beneath her name: Religious Accommodation Task Force, founding member. She didn't request it, didn't want it, but someone in HR had added it quietly like a nod of respect from a place once ruled by suspicion. She walked past the nurses' station. People greeted her with nods. Not because they had changed their minds, but because they had seen her stand and hadn't forgotten. She was no longer the one who defied the policy. She had become something else, the one who didn't flinch. In room 218, a young woman named Zaina was admitted after a failed suicide attempt. 18, quiet, veilless, eyes like shuttered windows. When Amina entered the room to check her vitals, Zaina didn't speak, but she stared long and hard at the cloth covering Amina's head. "You don't take it off?" Zaina finally asked. Amina paused. "No, not even here." Number Zaina was quiet, then very softly, "My parents forced me to wear it. I hated it." "I understand," Amina said gently. "But you choose it." Amina nodded. Zaina looked at the ceiling. "What made you choose?" Amina sat beside her. "When I stopped needing to be seen by the world and started wanting to be seen by the one who created me." Zaina didn't speak again. But when Amina left the room an hour later, the girl was holding her hospital blanket close to her head, as if testing the weight of covering in the safest place she had ever known. At lunch, Amina stepped outside the hospital, briefly sipping tea beneath the soft sunlight. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her until a voice said, "Excuse me, Nurse Rahman." She turned. It was a woman, middle-aged blazer hijab, tucked in elegant folds. "I'm from NHS Midlands," the woman said. "We're drafting faith-based integration protocols and someone on your team forwarded your name." Amina blinked. "We were wondering if you'd be willing to help shape national guidelines, not just for hijab, but for all religious wear. We need people who've lived it, not just studied it." Amina hesitated. "I'm not a scholar," the woman smiled. "No. You're something rarer. You're sincere." That evening after her shift, she returned to room 409. Mr. Whitaker's bed was empty now, but in its place stood a folded blanket and a note left by housekeeping. "Some patients leave scars, some leave lessons." He left behind silence that felt like peace. We think you had something to do with that. Amina placed her hand over the blanket and whispered, "May Allah grant you light in the grave." She didn't need to be seen, but somehow she was still being felt. Back home, her mother was waiting again. Same rug, same prayer beads, same smile that came from having lived long enough to recognize when a battle had been won without a sword. "You didn't just keep your hijab," her mother said. "You kept your niyyah." Amina nodded, tears gathering behind tired eyes. "Was it worth it?" her mother asked. Amina smiled. "They tried to make me remove cloth, but Allah used it to remove veils from hearts." A week later, Amina received a letter in the post. The envelope was pale pink. Inside was a photograph, a young girl in school uniform, hijab freshly wrapped, face beaming. On the back, written in a child's script, "I wore mine today. Like you do. Mom said you helped people without showing your face. So maybe I can help too." No signature, just your little admirer from Ward B. Amina placed the photo on her desk, right next to her Qur'an, and whispered, "Ya Allah." Let her grow up knowing that her worth is never in who sees her, but in who she follows. She returned to work the next day as always, not for recognition, not for revolution, but because faith isn't a flare. It's a lamp burning quietly held high in dark rooms so that others can see what dignity looks like when it doesn't need to shout. In a world where conformity is often rewarded and conviction quietly punished, Amina Rahman's story reminds us that true strength isn't loud, it's consistent. She didn't fight with protests or public fury. She stood firm in silence, embodying a faith that didn't seek approval, only obedience. Her hijab wasn't rebellion, it was reverence. And through her quiet defiance, she taught a truth that transcends hospitals and headlines. Dignity isn't granted by institutions nor revoked by policy. It is lived through the small, costly choices we make when no one is watching. We all face moments where principle collides with pressure. In those moments, Amina's example offers a map: choose what pleases God, not what pleases the crowd. Because in the end, it's not how visible we are to others, but how sincere we are before our Creator. That's where real honor lives. She walked into a courtroom, face fully covered, not to hide guilt, but to protect obedience. The judge demanded she unveil. The prosecutor accused her of defiance. The media called her dangerous, but her reply silenced the nation. Do you trust every face you see, or just the ones that comfort you? No shouting, no violence, just presence. So who was this woman who risked prison for a cloth? And why did a courtroom full of critics leave questioning their own reflections? Press 1 if this story pulls you in. Press 2 if it doesn't, but stay till the end, because she didn't just defend her veil, she unveiled something in all of us. The courthouse steps in Paris were slick with morning rain. Police held the line. Protesters swayed on both sides, one crowd waving French flags with cries of security. Aboard the other, lifting hand-drawn signs, "My faith is not a threat. Her veil is not your fear." Inside, the courtroom was already full. Reporters leaned over the banisters, cameras clicking in anticipation. Lawyers whispered. Students watched wide-eyed. Everyone had come for her. And then, the door opened. She didn't walk in like a criminal. She didn't walk in like a rebel. She walked in like the rain, soft, steady, unannounced. Layla Amari. She wore a navy jilbab that swept the marble like ink across parchment. Her niqab concealed all but her eyes that neither darted nor searched. They moved with stillness, like someone who had made peace with the cost long before this moment. The silence wasn't commanded. It was carried by her. The bailiff announced Case 349, the state versus Layla Amari, violation of Article 312 National Visibility Act. A soft murmur passed through the gallery. Layla moved to the defendant's table without flinch. No chains, no resistance, no drama. She folded her hands into her lap, a quiet sculpture of resolve. Her lawyer, Idris Benali, a silver-haired man with hands that trembled more than he admitted, leaned in and whispered something. She nodded once, then turned her eyes toward the bench. Judge Rousseau adjusted his robes. He was known for order, not mercy. He looked at her for a moment too long, perhaps trying to see what he couldn't, then tapped his gavel once. "Madame Amari," he said, You stand accused of entering Gare du Nord in full facial covering, refusing identity checks, declining to unveil for security staff, and breaching federal regulations. Layla's voice rang out gently. I did not resist. I only refused what my lord does not permit. Your lord, the judge repeated flatly. This court recognizes only the law of the republic. Layla bowed her head slightly. And I recognize both. But only one holds my soul. A sharp inhale cut through the crowd. The prosecutor, Clarice Dufour, rose from her seat, poised, polished, ready to strike. The issue, Your Honor, is not her belief. It's the threat that hiding poses. We cannot protect a society where the face, the very symbol of identity, is cloaked in secrecy. She turned to Layla. What are you hiding? Layla looked at her and replied softly. Nothing that would make you safer, but everything that makes me free. By the second day, the courthouse had changed. Outside, the protests had doubled in volume. A wall of bodies pressed against barricades divided by belief, but unified in noise. One side chanted, Liberté, Égalité, Sécurité. The other replied with, She is not a threat. She is our sister. Journalists now broadcast live from the courthouse steps. Cameras blinked like artificial eyes trying to read a story they couldn't feel. Inside, the courtroom pulsed with a different kind of tension, not anger, expectation, because something about Layla Amari unsettled people. Not her defiance, but her refusal to act like she was in a fight. She never raised her voice, never argued. She just stood still, and in a world obsessed with movement, stillness becomes rebellion. She sat quietly at the defense table, her fingers folded over one another. The same posture, the same poise. But today, even those who opposed her looked at her differently. Even Clarisse. The prosecutor stood with her notes tight in hand. Her voice, sharp as ever, echoed through the room. Your Honor, she began. This is not an issue of theology. It is one of transparency. If we allow individuals to override national regulations on the basis of personal conviction, we risk the integrity of our justice system. If she is permitted to veil in court, what message does that send? She turned to the gallery, gesturing slightly, almost theatrically. That identity can be negotiable. That visibility is a matter of faith, not function. This is not Tunisia. This is not Algeria. This is France. We build our freedom by uncovering truth, not hiding behind cloth. Layla didn't flinch, didn't blink. Idris Ben Ali rose slowly. His voice lacked the courtroom dramatics of his opponent, but it carried something else, conviction without combustion. Your Honor, he said, this isn't a case of concealment. It's a case of conscience. My client did not refuse identification. She offered to unveil in private before a female officer. Respectfully, quietly, he glanced toward Layla. She is not asking to be above the law. She is asking not to be stripped by it. Judge Rousseau rubbed the bridge of his nose. The lines on his face had deepened overnight. This court, he said sternly, has granted leeway. But the law is clear. In federal buildings, identity must be verified visually. No exceptions. Madame Amari's offer, while considerate, does not satisfy the requirement of transparency. Layla spoke then, her voice soft but piercing. May I address the court? He looked at her, paused, then nodded once. Layla stood. When she spoke, the room stilled. I do not object to being known, she said. I object to being exposed. A ripple of discomfort passed through the gallery. In your eyes, visibility is security, but in mine, obedience is safety. I am not hiding to deceive. I am covering to honor. My face is not a mask. It is a boundary. She turned slightly toward the audience. You think I'm dangerous because you cannot see my expression? But how many unveiled faces have lied to you with a smile no one answered? My veil is not silence. It is sincerity. And sincerity is not always visible. Clarice jumped up. Objection, philosophical conjecture. But Judge Rousseau held up a hand. Let her finish. Layla looked back at him. Your Honor, you said the law demands to see my face. But if the law cannot also see my soul, then what kind of truth is it asking for? No sound, no shuffle, just breathing. Judge Rousseau leaned back, visibly shaken by something he couldn't define. Something quiet, but undeniable. He cleared his throat. This court will recess until the afternoon session. Final testimonies will begin then. The gavel struck once, and the room exhaled. As the benches cleared, a young woman in the gallery, bareheaded in jeans, paused at the aisle. She looked at Layla with tears in her eyes, then whispered just loud enough for only one other person to hear, "I've never believed in anything like that, but I think I needed to hear it." Layla didn't smile, didn't speak. She just bowed her head gently. As she was escorted through the corridor, the noise of the protests had shifted. Not louder, not quieter, just changed. The holding cell was sterile, white windowless, humming with the low buzz of fluorescent lights. There were no cameras, no questions, just silence and the hum of loneliness echoing off tile and steel. Layla sat on a thin mattress, knees folded beneath her. The Qur'an rested in her lap like a shield. She traced its cover with reverent fingers, as if the ink could calm the ache in her chest. She wasn't afraid of prison. That was never the point. She wasn't afraid of Clarice Dufour or Judge Rousseau or the articles piling up in newsroom folders across the city. What pressed against her ribs was something quieter, a test not of law, but of sincerity. Would she remain true? Even when the world refused to understand her silence, a knock interrupted her thoughts. The door creaked open. A female guard stepped in, young, curious, not unkind. She didn't speak right away. Just watched Layla for a few seconds, as if trying to decipher how someone so still could be causing so much national noise. "You know, the guard finally said you could end all this tomorrow. Just lift it for 30 seconds. Show them you're not hiding anything." Layla didn't look up right away. Then softly, "I'm not hiding anything that threatens you, but I am protecting something that belongs to me." The guard tilted her head, like what Layla looked at her. No defiance, no bitterness, my submission. The answer landed without echo because it needed none. The guard sighed. "You're willing to go to jail for that?" Layla smiled gently beneath the cloth. "I'm not afraid of jail. I'm afraid of disappointing the one who set me free." The guard blinked. No clever response came. She left without another word. Alone again, Layla leaned against the wall, the Quran still in her lap. Her thoughts drifted not to news feeds or verdicts, but to memories. She was 9 the first time someone shouted at her in public. She and her mother were walking through a market in Lyon. Her hijab was new, slipping, uneven, tied with trembling fingers. A man yelled, "This is France. Take that rag off." She had looked up at her mother, eyes wide with shame. But her mother had smiled, knelt beside her and whispered, "What we cover, we protect. And what we protect, we honor." That day, Layla learned something deeper than modesty. She learned conviction. Years later in university, she debated a professor on live broadcast. He was articulate, charismatic, smiled as he challenged her. "How can you claim freedom in a face covering? How can you ask to be heard when you refuse to be seen?" Layla had answered without theatrics. "Freedom isn't the power to reveal. It's the right to choose when, how, and to whom I reveal myself. Freedom isn't exposure, it's discretion." The applause was polite, but afterward in the hallway, a Sikh woman in her 40s had approached her with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I've never had the courage to say what you just did." That was the first time Layla realized her niqab didn't just protect her. It gave voice to women whose strength hadn't yet found form. Back in the cell, she recited softly from the Quran, "Say verily, my prayer, my sacrifice, my life, and my death are for Allah, Lord of the worlds." Quran 6:162. Tears welled behind her veil, not from fear, but from the mercy of being able to remember who she was when no one else saw her. Meanwhile, in another part of the courthouse, a young journalist named Julien Vasseur sat in the media lounge, headphones, in replaying her testimony from earlier that morning. Again and again. He had expected anger, expected fire. What he heard instead was a voice calm enough to rearrange the furniture in his soul. He pulled up her background, master's in education, volunteer at a women's shelter, no criminal history, no activism, just Layla, a woman with a cloth on her face and a steel thread running through her voice. He stared at the court-issued photograph of her. Only her eyes were visible, but somehow they were more human than anything he'd seen all year. He closed his laptop, and whispered to himself, "Why does this woman who hides her face make me feel more seen than anyone else?" The third day of trial began under a sky thick with gray. The steps of the Palais de Justice were no longer loud, not because the crowds had disappeared, but because something had shifted. The jeers were gone, the chants quieted, even the flags moved less fiercely in the wind. What had started as a public outcry was turning into something else, a reckoning people didn't have words for. Inside the courtroom no longer crackled with performance. There was no stage left, only stillness. Layla stood as she had each morning, her steps soundless, her presence unwavering, the same navy cloth, the same calm in her eyes, but now even those who had come to condemn her found themselves listening differently. She rose to give her testimony. No theatrics, no appeal to pity, no anger, just the quiet clarity of someone who had nothing left to prove. She looked at the judge first, then slowly turned to the gallery, then to the cameras. "I am not here to challenge your laws," she said. "I am here because your laws challenge my dignity." A pause. "I do not come to provoke. I am not hiding a weapon. I am not hiding a crime. I am not hiding a statement. I am simply covering what I believe belongs first to God." Clarice Dufour leaned forward, ready to object. But Judge Rousseau raised a hand. "Let her speak." Layla's eyes softened in gratitude. Then she turned toward the room again. "I've been asked, why do you cover your face? What are you afraid of? But the better question is, why are you so afraid of not seeing me?" A murmur passed like wind through dry leaves. "You fear what you cannot label. You fear what doesn't reveal itself to your comfort. But my face is not my honesty, and my silence is not my guilt. And this veil," she touched the edge of it lightly, "is not your enemy." She let the moment breathe. In a world where women are sold their own image, where beauty is currency and value is measured by exposure, I chose something else. I chose to be known to my Lord before being seen by the world. A woman in the back wiped her cheek. "I've heard it said, if you have nothing to hide, show your face. But I ask you, has every unveiled face always told you the truth? Has every smile in a courtroom been sincere? Has every face in power ever earned your trust?" The air thickened. "You ask me to remove this cloth to earn your trust. But what have you removed to earn mine?" She turned to Judge Rousseau. "You say truth must be seen. But truth isn't in skin, Your Honor. It's in sincerity. And sincerity cannot be legislated." Not a soul in the room moved. Not because they agreed. Not because they understood. But because they felt something land without making a sound. Layla bowed her head slightly, not as a gesture of submission, but of completion. "I will not remove my niqab, not because I hate this country, but because I love something more than comfort, more than acceptance, more than safety." She looked up again. "I love the right to worship the one who made me, without apology, without disguise, without shame, silence, not stunned, not confused, but reverent." Even the journalists paused their typing. Even Clarice Dufour didn't rise, because the court was no longer a courtroom. It had become a mirror, and no one liked what they saw in their own reflection. Judge Rousseau leaned forward, this time not as an authority, but as a man uncertain of his next words. "Madame Amari, what do you see when you look at us?" Layla didn't hesitate. "I see a people afraid of shadows," she said gently, "when what they need is light." And just like that, it wasn't her they were watching anymore. It was themselves. Recess was called, but no one really left. The benches emptied into hushed hallways. Coffee cups went untouched. Judges retreated to chambers, but their footsteps were slower. Even the guards leaned a little less stiffly against the walls. Something invisible had filled the room that morning, and it hadn't left. Layla was led into a narrow corridor lined with tall windows. Outside, the rain had stopped. The crowd still lingered, but the shouting was softer, as if even the wind was holding its breath. She sat on a wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, her face still hidden, but her presence unmistakably seen. Across the hallway, behind a thick glass partition, a little girl stood no more than 6 or 7. Curls peeked from under her knitted hat. She clutched the hand of a young court clerk, maybe her sister. The girl didn't blink. She just stared at Layla, eyes wide with wonder. Layla turned slightly, meeting the child's gaze, and offered the smallest nod. The little girl smiled, genuine, free of politics, and whispered something through the glass. Her sister scolded her, gently tugging her away, but not before Layla read the words on her lips. "You look like a princess." Layla blinked, not because the words were strange, but because they felt like a memory from a world that existed before suspicion. A princess, not a symbol, not a threat, not a trial, just beauty through the eyes of a child. She placed a hand on her chest, a gesture of thanks, of prayer, of quiet ache. For the first time since the trial began, Layla felt tears rise behind her veil. Not from fear, not from frustration, but from mercy. Because in that child's eyes, dignity had not been debated, it had been recognized. The final session resumed with no fanfare. The cameras blinked silently. The seats filled quietly. The judge's gavel struck softer than before. Judge Rousseau looked older, less guarded, less certain of his authority. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and shuffled his papers, not out of need, but from discomfort. He spoke slowly now, measured, almost hesitant. "We've heard testimony," he said. "We've listened to arguments. But before this court reaches its judgment, we have one last question." He leaned forward. His voice dropped, not for power, but for intimacy. "Madame Amari, how can this court, how can this country place its trust in someone who hides her face?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a confession, a quiet admission of inherited fear. And every eye turned to Layla. She didn't move for a moment. Her hands remained still, her shoulders relaxed. Then she stepped forward just slightly. Her voice didn't rise. It fell. "Your Honor," she said, "do you trust every face you see?" A stillness spread like ink across water. "Do you trust every suit, every badge, every handshake? Have you never been lied to by someone who looked you in the eye?" She paused. "My face does not make me honest, and your seeing it does not make you safe." Now her voice lowered further, not to whisper, but to call the room to truth. "You ask how you can trust someone who hides her face. But I ask you, how do we trust a world that hides its soul?" Gasps didn't rise. Applause didn't follow. Because this moment was not meant for reaction. It was meant for recognition. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Because the lens can't capture stillness, only movement. And this stillness was sacred. Layla said no more. She didn't explain, didn't elaborate, because she didn't need to. The truth had been planted. And truth, real truth, doesn't shout. It simply remains. At the back of the gallery, Julien Vasseur sat frozen. His editor had texted 3 times. "Where's the story? Need quotes before press." Headline: "Veiled Woman Defies Republic." Thoughts. Julien didn't reply. He stared at Layla, the woman no one had truly seen. And slowly he slid his press badge into his coat pocket. He reached for a scarf, just something to warm his neck, and draped it loosely over his shoulders. Not as protest, not as performance, but as something quieter. Alignment. He had heard her, felt her, and like the rest of the room, he understood. She hadn't just answered their question. She had revealed their fear and unveiled their hearts. No cameras were allowed in the room when the verdict came. And perhaps, mercifully, that was the point, because some truths lose their weight when flattened into headlines. Layla stood at her table the same as every day before, still veiled, still silent. But something in the air felt finished, like the final note of a symphony lingering in a hall too stunned to clap. Judge Rousseau took a long breath. His voice was firm but tired, like a man who had finally learned the difference between clarity and control. "This court finds that Madame Amari did technically violate Article 312 by entering a federal transit station without facial identification. However," he looked down, then back up, "we also find that the enforcement of said law failed to provide a reasonable religious accommodation, as outlined in Section 14(c) of the Constitutional Liberties Clause." The room remained breathless. No fine will be issued. No sentence will be served. No criminal record will be upheld. This case is dismissed. A ripple passed through the chamber. Not shock, not relief, stillness. Because deep down, everyone in that room knew the law hadn't won. And neither had Layla in the way courts measure victory. What had prevailed was something beyond paperwork. The judge tapped the gavel once, and the room didn't erupt. It simply let go of something it had been holding too tightly. Layla whispered beneath her breath, "Alhamdulillah," and stepped away from the table. She didn't look back. Outside the courthouse, there were no reporters waiting to pounce. No mob, no roar of protest. What remained were women, some in hijab, some in niqab, some in jeans and long coats, some with no scarf at all. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not chanting, not posing, just waiting. When Layla stepped through the doors, she paused, and they didn't rush her, didn't swarm her, they simply joined her. One woman older stepped forward and gently took Layla's hand. Another offered her a small date wrapped in tissue, a quiet gift. No words exchanged, just eyes, just presence. Then together they began to walk down the steps, into the city, into a world that was still struggling to understand them. Across the street, Julien Vasseur watched from a distance. He didn't raise his camera. He didn't reach for his notepad. He just stood. Because something about the way they moved slowly, humbly, without performance, felt more historic than any soundbite. And somehow he knew. To try and capture it would only diminish it. That evening, in the silence of his apartment, Julien sat at his desk, staring at a blank document. He had prepared the structure earlier. Headline, summary, quotes, public response. He hovered his fingers over the keyboard and stopped. Because how do you write about a woman whose power was that she refused to be reduced to language? After a long pause, he typed a single line. She never raised her voice, but the world fell quiet when she spoke. Then he closed the file. He didn't send it to his editor, didn't post it online. Some stories, he realized, aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be felt. Layla returned to her life without press or applause. She didn't grant interviews. She didn't post statements. She didn't seek attention. She went back to tutoring young girls at the masjid. She volunteered at the shelter. She recited Qur'an in the early morning, long before the city stirred. One afternoon, while helping students prepare for their reading lessons, a small girl tugged at her sleeve. "Madam Layla," she asked, "did you win?" Layla smiled beneath her niqab. "I didn't go there to win," she said. "I went there to witness." The girl blinked. "Witness what?" Layla looked down and replied gently. "That truth doesn't need volume, just sincerity." That night, alone in her room, she unwrapped the small date given to her by the woman on the courthouse steps. Before eating it, she whispered a dua, not for the court, not for the law, not even for herself, but for a little girl behind glass who once saw a veiled woman and called her a princess, a child who gave back her dignity without asking to see her face. And beneath the layers of noise and judgment and law, that prayer floated upward, a prayer that only sincerity could carry. In the days that followed, the case disappeared from the front pages. Another scandal took its place. Another outrage filled the airwaves. And the woman in the niqab, the one they once debated with fury, was quietly forgotten by the headlines. But not by the people. In classrooms, students discussed her with furrowed brows. In cafes, conversations lingered around words like dignity and faith. And in homes across France, parents found themselves answering their children's questions with more softness than before. The country hadn't changed its laws, but something inside it had begun to shift, not in policy, in perception. Layla never spoke publicly about the case. She didn't need to. She returned to her quiet routines, teaching girls how to read, helping the elderly, with groceries, visiting the cemetery, with whispered duas on her lips. Once, while walking through the park, a young woman in sunglasses stopped her. "Are you her?" she asked. Layla tilted her head. "Her who?" The woman hesitated, then smiled. "I think you already know." She didn't ask for a photo. She didn't ask for answers. She simply placed her hand on her own chest and said, "Thank you," then walked away. Layla stood under the trees, the rustle of leaves like Allah's approval in the wind. One evening during her Qur'an circle, a girl named Amira looked up. She was quiet, shy, often afraid to speak. But that night, her voice carried something new. "Ustada Layla," she asked, "do you ever feel invisible?" Layla paused, then answered slowly, "I used to, when I thought being seen by people was the same as being seen by Allah." She looked at the group of girls. But invisibility in the world, she continued, doesn't mean invisibility to your Lord. A pause. Sometimes being unseen is where sincerity is safest. Amira's eyes glistened, and for the first time that month, she raised her hand to recite aloud. The courtroom itself became a different place after the trial. Security guards spoke in lower tones. Reporters chose words more carefully, and Judge Rousseau, though never openly admitting it, began to read more quietly from the Constitution, lingering on the sections about liberty of conscience. No one ever brought up Layla Amari again in session, but everyone remembered her, not because of what she wore, but because of what she refused to remove: her silence, her sincerity, her submission. Julian Vasseur never did publish that article. He received calls, emails, pressure from his editor. Don't waste the most talked about case of the month, they said, but he let it sit, unsent, unedited. One night, unable to sleep, he opened the file and reread the line he'd written. She never raised her voice, but the world fell quiet when she spoke. He added a second sentence, then closed the file for good. Some truths are not meant to be told, only remembered. He printed that line out, taped it to his wall, and wrote nothing for 3 weeks. For the first time in his career, he realized silence was also a kind of reporting. And the little girl, the one behind the glass, her name was Noor. She didn't understand politics. She didn't know what Article 312 meant. But she remembered the woman in navy blue, the one who stood like the moon against the courthouse steps. And in her notebook, under a drawing of a woman in a veil, she wrote in her best 6-year-old handwriting, Princess of Truth. Her sister found it weeks later and smiled. Why this title, she asked. Noor shrugged. Because she didn't need a crown. She already had light in her eyes. That night, Layla sat alone in her room, the tissue-wrapped date still on her shelf. She opened it. A simple act. But she paused before eating, hands cupped, eyes closed. Her dua was brief, private. Oh Allah, let me remain sincere when no one is watching. Let my silence speak louder than my voice. And let those who stare at the veil one day seek the light behind it. She took a bite and smiled beneath the cloth. Not because the world had changed, but because somewhere in it, a child had seen through a veil and found something worth imitating. In a world that equates visibility with value, Layla Amari's story reminds us that true dignity doesn't demand to be seen, it demands to be sincere. She did not raise her voice to be heard nor expose herself to be accepted. Instead, she chose quiet conviction over comfort, obedience over optics, and truth over approval. Her veiled presence revealed more than 1,000 exposed faces ever could that the soul's integrity matters more than society's validation. In our own lives, we often face moments where we're pressured to trade principle for acceptance. But Layla teaches us that silence, when rooted in truth, can be louder than argument. We don't need the world to understand our sincerity. We need the courage to remain sincere, especially when no one is watching. Because in the end, it's not how visible we are, but how faithful we remain.